Good morning or good afternoon from wherever you are joining us from. My name is Ellen Griesemer. I'm with the Future 500 team. Thank you if you have responded to our poll. We have a good mix, but a lot of people here with a 57% with a solid foundation. So that's awesome. Sounds like we are well grounded in the topic, but more to learn. My name is Ellen Griesemer, as I mentioned, and I'm an analyst here at Future 500. We are a nonprofit consultancy that builds trust between companies, advocates, and philanthropists to advance business as a force for good. I'd like to acknowledge my Future 500 and EarthX colleagues who are working hard behind the scenes to monitor our chat and help us keep everything running smoothly. Next slide, please. Great. So this webinar is the fourth in our virtual summit, which we're presenting in collaboration with our wonderful partners at EarthX in celebration of Earth Day 50. To learn more about speakers and topics, please go to future500.org/summit. So in the midst of the COVID pandemic, it can be really hard to think beyond tomorrow or the day after that. But climate change has long been really the climate emergency. And the other day, I read a quote that climate change needs to hire COVID-19's publicist. And despite everything that's going on, we really can't afford to stop thinking long term. And we must think about climate change solutions that can help us return not just to business as usual, but to a better world on the other side of this pandemic. So with that, I am thrilled to introduce our panelists for today's conversation. We'll hear first from Chad Frischmann. He is the VP and Research Director at Project Drawdown, the force behind the analysis and publication of the top solutions to help the world reach drawdown. And Brad Ack is a climate change veteran, having worked for more than 30 years in this space with organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund. He's now launched a new initiative, the Ocean Climate Trust, to focus on the ocean climate nexus in addressing climate disruption and to build an ocean climate restoration alliance. So first, we'll hear from Chad. I'd like to invite you to unmute yourself and begin sharing your screen.
All right. Hello, all. Let me just get my presentation up. 1 minute. Great. Can you see that? Super. So thank you, Ellen, and thank you all the folks at EarthX for hosting me today, and Brad, as well as a little bit later in the week when I'll be speaking at the EarthX Energy Conference as well. Really happy to see how EarthX has done such a wonderful shift to a virtual conference. It is one of our solutions at Drawdown called telepresence, how we can communicate over great distance using this wonderful technology. But first, I want to tell you what actually we're talking about when we refer to Drawdown. Drawdown is that point in time when atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases begins to decline on a year-to-year basis. It's that point when we take out more greenhouse gases than we're putting into Earth's atmosphere. And the proposition is really rather simple. When we change the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we start to decrease them, we can actually affect global cooling. But more than just a technical definition, Drawdown is a new way of thinking about and acting on global warming. It's that marker on the horizon pointing us towards a future that we actually want. A future where stopping and beginning to reverse global warming is possible with solutions that exist today. Now, we're all concerned about climate change, and we should be. It's the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced, and it's affecting us today, will affect our children tomorrow, and our grandchildren, future generations to come. But climate change is really a response of the system telling us what's going on. It's really a symptom of a deeper sickness. And the system is actually working. We have a sickness that's affecting our atmosphere, our terrestrial systems, our oceans, and human social and economic systems. So how do we actually solve the problem at hand? How do we begin the process of reversing global warming? Well, the only way we know how is to draw down, to avoid putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and to pull down what's already there. Now, it sounds possibly impossible. It sounds daunting, but humanity is really brilliant. Now, it's true at times we can also be incredibly dumb. That's true. But on a whole, we're a brilliant, amazing species. And we already have the technologies and practices today that, when taken together as a system of solutions, can achieve drawdown. It's not a technology question. It's not even a financial or economic issue. It's a matter of will to move farther and faster than we thought we needed to envision that future of tomorrow today. And why aren't we doing it, though? But part of the problem is that the science itself is often daunting and hard to take action with. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is one of the greatest scientific endeavors in human history in terms of just sheer data collection and collaboration amongst the scientific community. It is foundational to understanding the problem and the effect of that problem, global warming and climate change. But it does very little in terms of how can we take actions that solve that problem. And the science itself is often daunting, too inaccessible for most people to act upon. And how do we hear about global warming in the media today? We're inundated with stories of doom and gloom, horrifying headlines and terrifying images. This is an image of London. But for those of you who, well, aren't traveling anymore, but may in the future after the COVID crisis has passed, don't worry. London is not actually flooded. This is a photoshopped image crafted to elicit fear and panic. And when we're confronted by fear and panic, we run away. We have stories that are often very good. They come from good science, but they've been rebranded, reframed to solicit a sense of panic, of disempowerment. The apocalypse is upon you and there's nothing you can do about it. So you might as well order some discounted wine and some takeaway. You see that? This is marketing, people. And what we're marketing is the problem. We're marketing fear and we're marketing conflict. And when we combine this problem, fear, and conflict paradigm, this only elicits apathy, an indifference to the status quo. We need to reframe the way we think about the climate change and global warming to move away from problem fixing to envisioning solutions, to move away from fear to one of possibility, and away from conflict to collaborations, because it's in that combination of solutions, the possibility of what those solutions can achieve, and to address those through collaboration, not competition and conflict, but through collaboration, that we see opportunities. Opportunities to create the future that we want today. A future that can stop and begin to reverse global warming, as well as a cascading series of benefits to human and planetary well-being, as well as to our economy. Now, I lead a team of researchers from around the world. Here's a smattering of some of them. And together, this team of researchers has mapped, modeled, and detailed 100 solutions to stopping and beginning to reverse global warming. 76 to 80 of these solutions already exist today, and taken together, those solutions can achieve drawdown. 20 are coming attractions. These are solutions that are on the pipeline, and when they come online, are going to accelerate our progress farther and faster. But we don't need the future technologies in order to achieve drawdown. We have the technologies today. They're innovations that are going to help us move faster, for sure. But we also need to think about how to innovate existing technologies to make them more scalable, more economically viable, more efficient, more impactful. We have the technologies today and practices, and together we can achieve drawdown. What do these technologies do? What do these solutions and opportunities do? They do one or more of three things. First, replace existing fossil fuel-based technologies and practices with clean, renewable alternatives. Stop fossil fuel combustion and replace them with really viable solutions that don't use fossil fuels. Two, reduce consumption through technological efficiencies and behavior change. We need to reduce demand to avoid overconsumption to sustainable levels, and to restore carbon to our terrestrial systems, to restore carbon that is in the atmosphere to useful purposes. And the only way we know how with certainty is through restoring the natural carbon cycle, through a process we all learn about called photosynthesis, where we pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in plants, biomass, and soil organic carbons. It's a viable technology that's been developed and been innovated upon for billions of years. This is something we've tried and true we know. And there may be other engineered sinks that come along the way in the future when they become viable. But right now, we know what to do. And this is through natural climate solutions. So here's a list of some of those solutions, some of those specific technologies and practices that when taken together can achieve drawdown. Now you'll look at this list, it's just 20 of some of the more substantive solutions. It's really eclectic, a lot of different things on there. And as you can see, it touches upon all kinds of human activities, from food and health and education, industry, electricity, buildings, and so on. To the right of that slide there, you're gonna see these two numbers. Those are gigatons. Gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent that are either avoided or sequestered from Earth's atmosphere over a period of 30 years, from 2020 to 2050. And those two numbers represent two different scenarios. The first scenario is a scenario that will achieve a 2-degree warming target. And the second number is, when taken together, is a scenario that will achieve a 1.5-degree warming target. So this represents a range of different scenarios that are possible. But I want to point out one quick thing. When we talk about carbon dioxide equivalents, what do we mean here? We mean that we're not only assessing the potential of these solutions in terms of their carbon dioxide impact, but also other greenhouse gases that are incredibly important, like methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. And we have to convert them to their equivalent warming potential of carbon dioxide so that we can compare these different solutions, these opportunities, as apples to apples to apples. So what are some of the insights that we've learned through this process? First of all, when we often think about climate solutions, the first thing that typically comes to our mind is renewable electricity. And to be fair, it's incredibly important. It's a necessary set of solutions that accounts, because the sector, electricity generation, roughly accounts for 25 to 35% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's a huge part of the problem. And so many solutions are available to us to push us towards a clean, renewable grid that will reduce emissions substantially. But we also have to think beyond just electricity generation to how we're using that electricity and other forms of fossil fuel combustion. Things like buildings and industry account for 5 of the top 20 solutions that we've evaluated. And this is because building solutions use both grid-based energy as well as on-site combustion. And so when taken together, this accounts for about 40% of total greenhouse gases, depending on where you are in the world. But it also things like refrigerant management. We don't really think about refrigerants as being a climate problem, but when we think about the refrigerants that are used today in air conditioners and refrigerators across the world to cool the air, they're called hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. And HFCs are hundreds to thousands of times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And when we manage leakage of existing equipment and then destroy those HFCs at the end of life, we can avoid up to 58 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent simply by avoiding the leakage of HFCs into the atmosphere. We can also replace those refrigerants through alternative refrigerants, natural refrigerants that exist today that they don't require a tremendous amount of retrofitting in order to incorporate into our systems, but we have the technology today to replace those really high polluting HFCs, CFCs, and HCFCs with natural alternatives. We need to do that today. These solutions exist and they're incredibly important. But one of the things I think was really surprising in the work that we did at Drawdown is the impact of the food system itself. Now, the climate impact of food is often a surprise to folks, right? But if we really start to think about all the energy, all the emissions, all the labor that go into producing every seed, every drop of oil, every crust of bread, from production on farm, the tilling of the soil and releasing of that carbon that's stored in the soil, all the energy used for fertilizers and synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides, all that energy, all those emissions that are released through production, all the way through harvesting, processing. Think about all the factories producing glass, tin, cardboard, and plastic in order to put that food in, to package that food, to put on trucks, ships, and sadly, too often through luxury commodities on planes to go all over the world to transport that packaged food to markets. And in those markets, sadly, too much of that food gets wasted and through overconsumption of food, or assumed overconsumption by at the consumer scale, where grocery stores and markets overstock their produce and food items. And then it gets to your home, where if you're lucky, you might turn on an electric stove or a gas stove. If you're not so lucky and live in a least or less developed part of the world, you're often using cook stoves and burning biomass, which produce black carbon and noxious gases that are terrible for human health and well-being. And sadly, 30 to 40% of that food ends up in the landfill at the end and decomposes, emitting methane, which is 36 to 86 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So if we think about the entire supply chain of food, it becomes really obvious that the decisions we make every day, often 3 times a day, about what we produce, how we and what we consume and how we consume it, are perhaps the most substantive solutions that we all can take every day to stopping and beginning to reverse global warming. But we also have to think about how we manage our land, our current ecosystems, by protecting, restoring, and expanding our forests, wetlands, and currently degraded land by reforestation. We safeguard and expand carbon sinks that directly draw down carbon every year. This is how drawdown happens. And when we protect our ecosystems and protect that carbon from entering the atmosphere or restoring those forests, we also protect and restore biodiversity. These are incredibly important solutions that, when taken together with food, account for 10 of the most substantive solutions to stopping and beginning to reverse global warming. And taken together, this fundamentally shifts traditional thinking on climate actions by not only focusing on energy, our buildings, our transportation, our industry, our electricity generation, but also how we use land. How and why we use land is incredibly important to both avoiding emissions, but also part of the solution, because this is where we get the sequestration happening, where we get drawdown actually happening on a year-to-year basis. And the other solution I really want to point out here is providing universal health, universal access and quality of health and education. What we find is that by providing access to reproductive health care and freedom devoid of persecution to make your choices of your own body, as well as providing 12 to 13 years of schooling for girls and for boys, we have dramatically different life trajectories for households across the world. That includes delayed onset of marriage, improved economic activity, and lower family size. And what that accounts for, by addressing that systemic inequity in health, education, and gender, we have a series of cascading benefits that are helping men and women across the world to have more equitable lives and improved livelihoods. This is a human rights question that has an impact on climate. Because when we think about the system as a whole, we think about all of these systems interacting. We see that, first of all, this is a system of systems. None of these solutions operate in isolation. No system operates in isolation. They're all interconnected. When we think about health and education, this has impact on all of these other sectors, not least because of population shifts, how we can avoid or reduce higher population growth that we expect to happen without that health and educational resources. By providing that as for universal quality and access, we can reduce that estimated population and therefore reduce the demand for all of these other parts of the system. But health and education also have other benefits to the system by the adoption of all of these different solutions as well. So we see that it's really, really important to think about all these solutions together. And when we do so, we have to ask ourselves the question, is drawdown actually possible when we think about all the different solutions that are available to us to implement today that have all of these great effects? And the answer is absolutely. The drawdown is possible, but only when we think about this as a system of solutions. When we think about all of these solutions working together, because they touch upon all different aspects of human activity. There are no silver bullets here. There's not a buckshot of silver bullets that are going to get us there. In fact, all of the solutions are important. All of them are substantive, and they all have impact depending on where you are in the world, what context you live, your conditions in which you live. Some things may be more relevant to those of us who live in California, others more in Texas. Some might be more relevant for folks who live in Germany, others in South Africa and in India. Everywhere we go, there's going to be a different portfolio, a different set of solutions that matter most to that location, to that context. But what matters overall is that together, all of these solutions create a new system that can achieve a 2-degree warming target. Or if we're more ambitious with different types of technologies, can achieve a 1.5-degree warming target. It is possible to achieve this with solutions that exist today. It depends on the composition and how fast we choose to implement these solutions and where in the world we're doing that. But the great thing about this set of solutions is that we want them whether or not global warming was even a problem. Again, because they all have cascading benefits to human and planetary well-being. If we think about renewable energy systems, this provides clean, abundant access to energy for all. It reduces air pollution, improves health outcomes. Plant-rich diets, which is not a vegan or vegetarian diet, it's about reducing to healthy levels the amount of meat we consume as well as the amount of food we consume overall. But a plant-rich diet and reducing food waste results in enough food and sustenance for the world's population now until 2060 and beyond. When we think about health and education, these are human rights issues. These aren't climate issues. This is about human rights and gender equality. It's about economic improvement for all people, and it has an effect on climate. And when we think about protecting our ecosystems, as I said before, protecting our forests and wetlands and degraded land, allowing natural regrowth to occur for reforestation efforts, this restores biodiversity. It protects biodiversity. It protects life on this planet. And if we think about all the different solutions that are available to us for regenerative agricultural practices and livestock management, these restore carbon to the land. They improve soil productivity. They benefit farmers across the board, large scale and small scale. They become more efficient, they're more profitable, they increase yield. These are win-win-win solutions. In fact, you might say they're win for all solutions, because when we implement a system of solutions taken together, we can achieve the sustainable development goals. At least help us go very far along that way. And after we achieve the sustainable development goals, this system of solutions actually goes beyond that. It goes beyond sustainability towards a regenerative system, a regenerative economy that's not built on exploitation and extraction, but built on restoration and regeneration, creating abundance for all and creates profit. If we think about how much this costs to implement this entire system of solutions, and both of these scenarios, because of the ingenuity and innovation of humanity, we're looking at an additional cost of implementing these system of solutions at about roughly 20 to $30 trillion over 30 years. That's $1 trillion a year, which sounds like a lot, but is a drop in the bucket if we think about global GDP being well over $80 trillion a year. So this is a small investment to make, particularly when we consider the net operational savings. This is how much it would cost to operate all of this system of solutions compared to what we would have to do anyway, and the benefit that we would achieve by implementing a system of solutions. And as you can see, return on that investment is 3 to 4 times what we're actually putting into it. So these are win, 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 win for all solutions. I like to think of it as like a duh moment. There are enough benefits that something clicks in your mind. There are too many ahans in this system of solutions that it just becomes a duh. And I hope that translates, because we have available to us a pathway to build a regenerative future that we want, that benefits all people, no matter what type of business you have, what kind of constituency you have, what are the things that drive and motivate you. We can create a regenerative future today, because today we are the regeneration. We are a generation. There's no more generation X, Y, and Z. Together, we are a generation that can create that future that we want today. So I challenge us all to rethink our global goals, to go beyond stabilization, beyond sustainability, and think towards a regenerative system, because it's going to benefit all people. And I encourage you to look to Drawdown and look to other resources about what are the solutions that are most meaningful to you in your day-to-day actions and your actions as business leaders, as decision makers, and in your own households. So thank you, and I'll turn it over now to Brad to take over here.
Thank you, Chad. I'm going to share my screen now, so just give me 1 second to do that. Okay, so I appreciate those comments, Chad. I am going to start actually with a little bit of doom and gloom, because I take a slightly different view on this, I guess, than you do. I do think, in fact, that I think the COVID experience has shown that we actually can react in the face of emergency and in the face of peril. And perhaps it's that we haven't seen just quite how much there is. So I'm going to talk to you today about the climate emergency that we're in and an agenda for climate restoration. Not 1.5, not 2 degrees, but restoration. Got a few key points. First, the global climate crisis is well underway. We are living in the midst of it and seeing the effects all the time. Our response to that crisis is failing. We need new approaches. Climate restoration should be the goal of these approaches. We're at 1.1 degrees of warming now. That is not safe. We see all kinds of damage from that. Shooting towards a goal of 2 makes very little sense to me. Climate restoration means we have to go well beyond just stopping greenhouse gas emissions. We have to clean up a 150-year legacy of pollutants that are in the atmosphere. And given the race against time that we face, we very well may need life support interventions to protect the vital organs of the planet while we cool the planet. But there is a way forward, and the key resources to achieve this transition to climate restoration are going to be ingenuity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So the doom and gloom. We see the climate crisis all around us, from enormous bushfires in Australia to the wildfires in California to a veritable plague of locusts in Africa this year, directly connected to warming in the Indian Ocean, to superstorms that leave our communities devastated. We now have what is thought to be one of the first human-caused mega droughts in the Western United States going on right now, and we have heat waves in both the northern and southern hemispheres at the same time. The UN warns us that climate disasters are happening at the rate of once a week. And climate scientists have told us that, in fact, we do face a climate emergency. Over 11,000 of them signed on to this statement just last year. And I think this is a very important element. The climate crisis is not only here, but it is accelerating faster than most scientists expected or than most models predicted, and it is more severe than anticipated. Now, I think we actually have to know this, and we have to internalize it, because denial of that leads, in fact, to inaction and leads to apathy. But those people who have self-selected to become leaders in this space must actually embrace what the science is telling us. And that is that we are in an absolute emergency, and we should be waking up every day and acting as if we are. Now, unfortunately, climate change politics aren't working. And I think we all have a pretty good idea about that. Since Paris, which was lauded as the first major international agreement on climate, CO2 emissions have continued to rise. More than $2.7 trillion of new money has been invested into fossil fuel development since then. And the British Petroleum Statistical Review of World Energy shows that global CO2 hit a new all-time high in 2017. Okay, so that is the backdrop. Now, everything Chad talked about are solutions to this problem, and I applaud and welcome all of that. But I would still posit that we need a new plan. Basically, the plan that we've been following has left a lot to be desired, and we need a new climate safety plan. So, what is my proposal for climate safety? Well, we need to build a portfolio around climate restoration. So I think this is a very important concept. Climate restoration is the concept of going back to something that we evolved with over 10,000 years, which is atmospheric carbon under 300 parts per million. Ever since we've departed from that norm, we've seen increasing destabilization of the planet, and to suggest that 1.5 is a safe climate target or stable, I think is not borne out by the science. In fact, it's a recipe for continued destabilization. So we have to set our sights higher. There's three parts to this portfolio. The first one is to decarbonize, which is to cut future emissions, and much of what's in the Drawdown agenda will do that, and we need to accelerate that dramatically. But we also need to recognize that it is going to take time. The kind of systems that are layered upon systems that Chad's slides reflected don't change easily. And we have to remember that there are powerful vested interests behind some of the systems continuing as they are. They will change. The economics are against them, but time is of the essence. And so we need a second part of this agenda, which is negative emissions. We have to get very serious about drawing carbon out of the atmosphere quickly. And the numbers I have here, the 30, 30, and 40, are illustrative at only. They could be completely different, but I do want to highlight that negative emissions is very underinvested at this point in time and needs massive increases in investment. And then the third part of this portfolio I call hedges, or ecosystem life support, and I'll get to that. So first, decarbonization. I think we've already talked about that. I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip over that. But this is from the IPCC 1.5 degree report. It does point out that these kind of transitions in decarbonization are unprecedented in terms of scale. So let's not minimize just how challenging it will be to decarbonize an economy that is built around the use of fossil fuels, and frankly has benefited many of us, all of us, in many ways. And it's going to take a lot of time to transition away from that. So we have to get more serious about negative emissions. And negative emissions essentially are cleaning up this pollution that we've put into the environment for the last 150 years. Carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere is now at about 411 parts per million. It was around 280 during most of the Holocene. It fluctuated between 260 and 300. These levels of 411 are inconsistent with a safe climate. And if we were to stop emitting today, we would continue to see our climate destabilize, because the heat trap will continue, and there's positive feedback loops in the system. So we must move to pulling that carbon back out of the atmosphere and restoring the climate. And you could think about this like, it's like cleaning up a Superfund site. If you live near an estuary or waterway that has been degraded with, let's say, industrial contaminants for for many, many years, just stopping the flow of those contaminants does not fix the system. You actually have to go in and clean it up, and nobody seems to object to Superfund sites. Let's start to think about our atmosphere is like a Superfund site. It is extremely polluted and dangerously so. And even just to get to 1.5, which I'm saying we should go well beyond, the IPCC says very clearly that you need massive amounts of carbon dioxide removal, somewhere between 100 to 1,000 gigatons over the 21st century. And for context, our current annual emissions of CO2 are around 38 gigatons and about 50 to 55 of carbon equivalents when you take in the other greenhouse gases. So we have a massive task ahead of drawdown of negative emissions. Now, there's a number of pathways to get there, and Chad discussed a number of the natural pathways, which are bolstering natural sinks. I'm all for that 100%. I've been in the environmental field my whole career, but I also recognize that everything has to go perfectly for that system to be the only system we take. And so we know that there are also industrial approaches, and there's some real ideological divides preventing us from moving faster on some of these, because they tend to perpetuate and prolong the fossil fuel industry, or at least that's what people think. But if our enemy is carbon, and right now it must be carbon, systems that capture carbon and store it need to be deployed, and we need to support those, as well as things like direct air capture, which is pictured on the right of the screen. And there's a number of new and innovative ideas around capturing carbon from flue gases and storing it permanently in things like concrete and making all sorts of other materials out of it. So there is a whole ecosystem of innovation around this. Now, the oceans have enormous potential for drawdown, but they've been mostly an afterthought in the carbon dioxide removal discussions to date. The discussion has focused on natural sinks like wetlands and salt marshes and mangroves and seagrasses, which are really important for a variety of reasons. They have enormous benefits to society, but they won't be anywhere near enough to get to that kind of gigaton scale. So we have to look at other forms of ocean carbon dioxide removal. This is an illustration of a large-scale kelp operation that grows seaweeds to produce a lot of useful products, including food and feed and fuel, but also can sequester significant amounts of carbon. There are a number of other ocean CDR approaches, and they need significant increases in dollars and talent to really start to investigate them further. Iron fertilization may be known to some of you, fairly controversial. It's seeding the ocean with nutrients to create phytoplankton blooms that then capture carbon and are ultimately, that carbon, some portion of it is ultimately stored in the sediments. I'm not advocating for any of these. I'm advocating for the science and research and development to know whether they work. NASA has developed a program called Omega, offshore membrane enclosures for growing algae, which also, again, capture carbon from the atmosphere and the water and sequester it. And there are others. Many people contact me with their solutions for ocean-based carbon capture. This one is called the oxygenator. It uses assisted upwelling and downwelling to create phytoplankton blooms and then move the carbon down into the lower parts of the ocean. Again, not advocating for any saying that we need to do the science for all of these, because the only way out of this, in the words of the Martian, is to science the shit out of it. Pardon my language, but that is in fact what we're going to have to do. Now, one more component is still needed in this climate restoration portfolio. Even if we were to have a dramatic increase in the pace of greenhouse gas emission reductions, which we're seeing no sign of, and with successful deployment of these as yet undeveloped systems that take CO2 and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere at scale in the hundreds to thousands of gigatons, even if we got there, we still have a probability greater than zero of a spectacular loss of assets. meaning the planet that we live on and its systems that sustain us. So when you have that sort of a risk in any prudent portfolio, you have to have hedges. In this case, hedges are the interventions that could buy us time by prolonging critical parts of the global ocean climate system that sustain us. So why do I say we need hedges? Well, you've probably all heard about tipping points. There are a series of tipping points out there in the climate that are too risky to bet against, in the words of this particular journal article. They are mutually reinforcing, meaning that as they begin to tip, let's take permafrost, as it begins to thaw, it creates a positive feedback loop that puts more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and it risks putting us into a state where human interventions no longer will have much of an impact. The system sort of takes over, and we call it climate, rapid climate change. There was a report last year from the IPCC on the ocean and the cryosphere, and it highlights some of these critical, what I will call these vital organs of the climate system, the ocean climate system. The first one is Arctic sea ice. It's like the refrigerator for the planet, and it has been performing a variety of really critical climate stabilization roles for many years. And as we are losing that ice, we are losing those functions and suffering a fair number of consequences. Land ice, particularly the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, threaten ocean circulation and ocean salinity. The loss of permafrost, I just mentioned the risks there. Ocean alkalinity, which is the steady pH balance the oceans have maintained for millennia, which is now threatened by the absorption of carbon dioxide directly into the ocean. And finally, ocean heat, which has been absorbed about 90% of all the heat generated by greenhouse gases, and that is affecting coral reefs, it's affecting fish, it's affecting the oxygen levels in the ocean, it's leading to these superstorms. So these are 5 critical tipping points that are on their own time trajectory and may or may not be influenced by how fast we draw down carbon and stop emissions. So therefore, we need hedges that try to bring conscious engineering to bear on these critical elements. And these aren't the only ones. There are terrestrial tipping points as well. There's some atmospheric tipping points, but these are the ones I'm particularly focused on as the Ocean Climate Trust. So there are people who have, there's a lot of innovators and inventors out there working on this. I'm just going to highlight a couple. This is ICE 911, which is working on a silica bead proposal to improve albedo on land ice and reduce the rate of melt. There was a team at ASU that's proposed how to restore Arctic sea ice using windmills. There's proposals for marine cloud brightening that essentially create clouds using seawater and reduce the warming of the ocean. And that, in fact, is being tested right now to reduce heating of the Great Barrier Reef, which just bleached for the 3rd time in 5 years. So these, again, I'm not advocating for any single one of these, but these are the kind of solutions that we need to get a lot more serious. Actually, not solutions, the kind of hedges that we need to get a lot more serious about, because buying time could be the difference between winning and losing. There's similarly approaches to slowing ocean acidification by adding alkaline material into oceans and seawater to draw down carbon. This is a page draw from Project Vesta, which is using olivine to do advanced weathering. So if this truly is an emergency, does it make sense to take any possible solutions off the table? I would say no. And I would say that we need to turn our minds to the concept of conscious engineering in this 3rd part of the climate restoration portfolio, because we are currently in a random, uncontrolled global experiment that has been taking place over the last 150 years of putting all of our waste products into the atmosphere. And that uncontrolled experiment is leading to some very, very dangerous outcomes. And therefore, I would advocate we need to start getting serious about conscious engineering. So, my final notes. We're in the climate crisis now. It is an emergency, but we're not acting like it. Even those of us in positions of leadership are still in some form of denial here. The climate portfolio needs new fronts of action, in particular, a massive scaling up of negative emissions and much more serious approach to hedges. We're going to need a great deal of new thinking and talent to meet these challenges. We're going to need synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotechnology, industrial ecology, you name it. There's all kinds of disciplines that we need to apply, and we have no time to waste. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks so much to both of you. Definitely some food for thought. And I know we've had questions rolling in throughout both presentations. So we'll try to get to as many as they can. Both Brad and Chad have kindly offered to stay on the line for a few extra minutes. So let's dig in so we can get to a few here. And if we don't get to your question, we'll do our best to get back to you if it wasn't asked anonymously. All righty. So first up, we have a question for Chad, an anonymous question asking if you've homed in on the drawdown strategies that businesses can drive the most readily.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, the list of solutions that we highlight in Project Drawdown are designed to be types of technologies and practice that everybody can take some sort of action on depending on their level of agency. So we evaluate solutions that are most applicable for individuals at household scale, business owners, building owners, utility scale operators, policymakers, and we assess these solutions from the perspective of the agent or the decision maker themselves. And the reason we want to do this is the full scoping of potential stakeholders is because everybody does have a role to play. We need to get everybody's actions on the table here, both from a bottom-up approach as well as a top-down. We need that action, individual action. We need the top-down policy making to regulate the system. But we also need what I call the middle out. These are institutional transformation around business, the way we do business, through our educational institutions, our financial institutions, to where the I becomes the we, right? So we as a community to take action. And so there are many solutions that are viable for businesses to be taking on, whether that's a business that looking at their own internal operations, the buildings that they own or operate, or their supply chains, or looking at how they can be investing into technologies and practices that are relevant to their operations. There's a whole list of different ones. And yes, we have certainly honed in on those that are most relevant for businesses, but we want to make sure that we show that it's not just the role of businesses, it's also the role of individuals in their own decision-making, and because we all need to be linking arms and coming together in this time of emergency. And I want to just echo what Brad says. We are in a climate emergency, and in fact, I'm a signatory on the Planetary Emergency Declaration and the climate emergency, as well as the Planetary Emergency Declaration, which is another declaration that we're on that goes beyond climate to looking at biodiversity, our human and planetary systems more broadly. So we are signatories to this, and I'm in these discussions because we are in a planetary emergency and we need to be addressing them. What I would say, though, is that we do have technologies that are sufficient to achieve a 1.5. And this is what I meant when I said go beyond stabilization, go beyond sustainability to a regenerative system. We can achieve these targets that are set out by the scientists, but we can go beyond them. We can go beyond the 1.5 degree scenario and achieve drawdown sooner and faster when we implement existing solutions that tackle all areas of human activity. And we can do so because it's profitable opportunities that we all have decision-making capacity to do on a daily basis and to invest in the future. We need to think about how we work together as a system now and not wait for that thing to come along in the future. Because if we wait too long, we'll miss the opportunity to take action now. And that's where we need to go to. We need to take action immediately now to solve the climate emergency that is in front of us. And doing so by really looking at the technologies and practices that are already here and that we can implement today, tomorrow, and in the next decade to avoid the tipping points that Brad really eloquently and correctly pointed out. We are going to experience global warming no matter what we do. We already are on a pathway towards a 1.5 scenario. We need to stop. We need to turn off the flow of emissions going in there as a starting point, and in parallel draw down those emissions. And we have viable solutions in front of us. So why not?
Yeah, so it sounds like, pathways forward for lots of stakeholders, individuals, businesses. Brad, I want to give you a chance to respond. It looked like you may have had a thought, but I'll throw in a question here for you. So you've proposed all this new work around the ocean climate nexus and then some potential solutions, but how do you see your work with Ocean Climate Trust unfolding?
Well, we need roadmaps, and to me, Drawdown is an amazing roadmap that lays out a whole series of things that can be done. We need more roadmaps because there are still things yet to be developed, like ocean-based carbon drawdown, like ocean alkalinity enhancement, like restoring polar ice or prolonging polar ice. And part of that road mapping has to bring multiple disciplines together. There are so many good scientists that are part of that process, but we need engineers, we need chemists, we need policy people. We need to create the roadmaps, and then we need to engage the innovation community, which is global. It's our most precious resources, the human intellect, and it's at a point of evolution higher than it's ever been. And I've seen this across a lot of topics I've worked on in the past. Plastics is a good example. When we put a problem very clearly dimensioned out to the innovation sphere, we will get all sorts of creative thinking, rapid prototyping, testing, and development. And so there's so many people who want to be part of this solution, they don't know what to do. We need to give them the clarity around how these solutions, what these potential solutions are, what the obstacles are, what are the critical points where we need new invention or innovation. And as Chad said, many of these things we already know how to do, but we don't know how to make them go to scale. And so you might need lawyers, you might need economists, you might need political scientists. But what we have to do is we have to highlight these problems very clearly so that we can engage the solution-oriented crowd. I'm not waiting for government. I've spent 30 years in this field, and they don't lead. Okay, they follow, but they're not going to lead. We're going to have to lead from the private sector, from the academic sector, from the scientific community, and then as we move, we'll build that momentum that they will follow.
Great. So Chad, back to you. A question about if you're finding that project drawdown solutions, how are they viable economically in emerging markets? Somebody's asking about how manufacturing heavy economies are going to lean in on lowest cost energy solutions. So how does the developed world help incentivize the transition to cleaner solutions?
That's a really good question. And of course, what we need to start thinking about that these are solutions because they're economically viable today, because they can be implemented in high income and low income countries, in urban and rural communities, that these are ways to actually leapfrog ahead of traditional development trajectories. We need to think about the least and less developed developed countries, low-income countries, as they move forward into emerging economies, to think about how we can avoid needing to decarbonize from the starting point, right? We don't need to be carbonizing our economies to then decarbonizing in the future. This is an opportunity to leapfrog ahead because these solutions exist today. And this is why we can't wait to be implementing them. And this is where the developed countries, and I agree with Brad here, that we shouldn't be waiting for anybody. We should be all taking action, linking arms together, policymakers, individuals, companies across the spectrum. And when we start to implement more of these, invest more into technologies in developed countries and in less developed countries, we lower through economies of scale and efficiencies and innovations in these technologies themselves, we make them more viable, more cost effective to be implemented in these and less developed countries. So this is a way to leapfrog ahead. And we've seen countless examples of technology transfer that have actually worked in leapfrogging economies forward. And we should be taking this opportunity today, right now, and not only focusing on developed countries, because OECD countries are already on this pathway, and they need to do a lot more faster, but they're on a pathway to this anyway. And in parallel, we need to be implementing and supporting these solutions in less developed countries. And I think there are mechanisms that we can do that. And part of it, there are market responses, there's policy responses. These are all possible mechanisms that we could be implementing to move this, accelerate this forward in those emerging economies. But it's really a framing, I think. It's really a framing to, and I talk to leaders in many countries around the world, and I often have this discussion is, why would we want your economies to be implementing fossil fuel-based economies or investing more into the infrastructure that's going to advance your economy when we already know where you want to be in 20 years from now? Why not invest now because it's profitable now? And let's figure out a way to get that going. And I think we do have the potential to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of the sentiment about we're all in this together. So I think a good follow-up question, and Brad, this is for both of you, but Brad, we can start with you. We'll just try to get to 2 more questions here before we sign off. Somebody's asking about what are the most surprising collaborations that you've seen as far as solutions building? So Brad, you want to take it away?
Well, I mean, I think I don't have any great examples in this space. Unfortunately, Chad may have more. I mean, especially in what I'm talking about, they're just starting to emerge. Okay. I'm seeing a tremendous amount of innovation. I'm getting contacted by people with innovations all the time, and so there's this tremendous sort of proliferation of creativity. But in other spaces, I think the ocean plastics is a really good example of some highly unlikely partnerships that have been formed between very large companies, between scientists, between environmentalists, between communities. And, there's action on so many fronts in that very difficult field. To me, it's a real analogy that we need to try and figure out, how do we take that, the sort of an issue that went from zero consciousness 7 years ago to probably one of the highest environmental consciousness issues on the entire planet in the space of 5 to 6 years, and now has tens of thousands of people working on it. We need to figure out what were the elements of that process and apply them to climate restoration. And again, I just want to really emphasize restoration. I have 2 kids. I don't want them to live in a world of 1.5. 1.5 is not a good world. 1.1, where we are now, is not a good world. Look at what just happened in Australia, California, Africa. It is an unsafe world now. We need to go back to a safe climate. And we need to, I think it's dangerous for too many of us in this field in leadership to keep going along with what is a political science target, not a science target. It's not safe, and most scientists will tell you it's not safe.
Chad, is that a question you want to jump in on about most successful collaborations?
How much time do we have?
I think we'll just take another minute.
Okay, I want to address actually what Brad just said here, and I want to reiterate that when we approach our work at Drawdown, and I think many other folks in this space, when I think about a regenerative system, a regenerative society, regenerative economy in the future, it is not a lie. It is not, let's achieve this target. In fact, I agree with you 100%. These targets are meaningless. Nobody gets super excited about 1.5 degrees, and we don't even know what that means precisely. If it's 1.6 or 1.4, 1.3, 1.7. There's so much uncertainty built around that the target is relatively meaningless. What we need is a target like Drawdown, right? It helps us achieve that future that we actually want today. Let's ignore the targets. And let's say, yeah, sure, we can achieve those targets and go beyond them. And that's really, I think, super important to bear in mind. And the only other thing that I would want to respond to Brad here is I think when we talk about climate restoration, I think it's potentially problematic because we'll never be able to restore the climate to the way it was before. The climate is not going to suddenly shift and become, even if we achieve the exact parts per million that we would expect to 150 years ago, the climate and the ecosystems of the planet has already changed, will already change, and will not be restored to some past utopic world that we hope we would have. And indeed, there are consequences. So I want to offer caution here because there are consequences moving in that reversing of global warming or reversing of those to some other past. Possibly the effect on the planetary system could be as devastating as the steep rise that we've had in global warming. If we suddenly go back down really fast, the response of the ecosystems is not really clear how they would respond. So there's some danger here, I think, in focusing too much on climate restoration, because A, it won't actually be restored to what it once was. B, there's potential pitfalls and dangers that the ecosystems may not respond to. And C, we're technically meant to be moving towards an ice age at this stage. And so where we end up being situated now in the future, it's not really a restoration effect. It's let's just create the future that we want. Not look back to the past as to what could have been, but let's look to the future. Where do we want our human and planetary systems to be? We want them to be healthy. We want them to be vibrant. We want them to be restorative and regenerative, and create that future that we want today through a system of solutions. I want to just really stress this, because I fear the restoration can get into as much problems as the warming can have. So
well, I think getting to a healthy climate for all is definitely something that we can all agree on. I know we've run over time, and I really appreciate both of you for taking some extra time. We've had so many questions flooding in, and just want to thank both the panelists again, and for all of you who have hung on with us as we've run over time. Thank you so much. And I'll just briefly mention, please visit future500.org/summit to register for our next upcoming webinar, which is actually tomorrow at 10 Pacific with Bill Weil from Climate Voice. So hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much to everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.